The kitchen was quiet. That's where this story ends up. In a quiet kitchen, late at night, with a child asleep somewhere down the hall. And that quiet is the first thing I want you to hold on to, because by the time you understand it, this story will already be over. Maren Holloway made tea. She filled the kettle, waited for it, poured slowly, the way you move when you're not in a hurry. Not because you have nowhere to be, but because you already know what's waiting at the table when you sit down. She opened the second drawer in the kitchen, reached for the folder she kept there, the kind people set aside for the documents you need every few years. Then urgently, all at once, she placed two things on the table: a bank transfer receipt and her daughter's birth certificate, side by side, the way you'd set down any two ordinary pieces of mail. No ceremony, no hesitation, just the quiet, deliberate act of a woman who needed to see two things next to each other. She sat with both hands around her mug, looked at what was in front of her, and if you had walked into that kitchen right then, if you had seen the steadiness of her hands, the stillness in her face, you would not have known that anything was wrong. She looked, if anything, at peace. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the papers, not what was on them, but the peace, the particular calm of a woman who has finally arrived somewhere she'd been slowly moving toward for 3 years, and discovered that the truth, once you stop turning away from it, no longer has the power to break you, only to clarify. Tucked inside that folder, between the two documents she'd placed on the table, was a small slip of paper, handwritten, her mother's handwriting. 7 words, written the way you write something you mean for someone to carry, for when you need a real beginning. We'll come back to that. If you've ever had a feeling that something wasn't right, not a loud feeling, not one that arrived with proof, but a quiet one, the kind that settles beneath your normal days and stays there, the kind you couldn't name, not even to yourself, because nothing you could point to looked like enough. Subscribe to Wounds Among Kin, because Maren Holloway carried that feeling for 3 years, and this story is going to give it a name. Now, let's go back to where this started. Maren's mother didn't die the way people die in stories. There was no hospital room, no gathered family holding hands around a bed, no final words delivered with the gravity of someone who knew they were being heard for the last time. Dolores Holloway went on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, in her own bed, in the house where she had lived for 31 years. She went the way she had done most things in her life, without making a fuss, without asking anyone to rearrange their schedule. Maren flew home to Raleigh. She handled the arrangements the way her mother would have wanted them handled, efficiently, without drama, with a practiced steadiness that people at the reception mistook for strength. She smiled at the right moments, said the appropriate things, accepted the casseroles and the condolences with equal grace. She cried once, in a rental car, parked outside a Cracker Barrel off the highway on the way back to the airport. She sat there for 11 minutes with the engine running and let herself feel the full weight of it. Then she drove to the terminal, returned the car, and boarded her flight home. That was how Dolores had raised her. You feel it, then you move. The inheritance came through 6 weeks later, $260,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a life. Decades of deliberate, careful living, skipped vacations, one used car purchased secondhand and driven until the transmission gave out, store brand everything, every year, without complaint. The slow, patient accumulation of a woman who believed that what you saved was a measure of what you truly valued. Inside the estate documents, folded neatly between 2 pages, was a note in Dolores's handwriting, for when you need a real beginning. Maren read it twice, set it down, put the money in a high-yield savings account, and didn't touch it for 8 months. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She was, in truth, waiting to feel like she deserved it. She had been with Ronan Vale for 2 years by the time her mother's money was sitting in that account. They'd met at a mutual friend's dinner party in Charlotte, the kind of gathering where everyone knows each other just well enough to be interesting and not well enough to be honest. The kind of room where people perform their most polished selves and call it an evening. Ronan wasn't performing. That was the first thing she noticed. He was standing near the bookshelf along the far wall, not working the room, not positioning himself toward any particular conversation, just quietly trailing his fingers along the book spines, reading titles to himself the way some people hum under their breath, doing something private in a public space, without embarrassment, without any awareness that it might read as odd. She crossed the room. He was an architect, Had his own small firm, Veil Plus Partners, though the partners part was generous. It was mostly him, a project manager named Dex, and a rotating cast of freelancers brought in per project. But he spoke about the firm with a calm, rooted confidence that didn't need the room's agreement to exist. He talked about buildings the way certain people talk about music, as though structures had emotional frequencies most people were simply too distracted to hear. He said, that first evening, that the best building he'd ever walked into had made him feel like it already knew him. She understood exactly what he meant. She wasn't sure that was a safe thing to feel on a first conversation. She was a grant writer for a nonprofit focused on rural education, good at it, not because she loved the bureaucratic machinery of it, but because she understood how to translate need into language that moved people. She knew inherently that people don't give because they're convinced. They give because they feel something first and justify it afterward. She felt something, sitting across from Ronan that first night. She would later describe it as equal parts recognition and warning, the way a place can feel like home and like somewhere you've never been, both at once, in the same breath. There was a habit she noticed early, small enough to dismiss. When Ronan told stories about things that had gone wrong, his own role in them shifted slightly in the retelling. Not lying, exactly, just softening. The edges of his mistakes rounded down, the weight of his choices redistributed quietly across circumstance, timing, other people's decisions. It bothered her more than she ever said. She filed it away in the quiet place where she kept things she wasn't ready to name. She would open that file again, sooner than she expected. Their daughter arrived 14 months into the relationship. Ahead of schedule, the way real things tend to come, before you're fully ready, before the timing is right, requiring you to rise to meet them whether you feel prepared or not. They named her Ren. She came into the world with dark eyes and a serious expression that made the delivery nurses laugh. The look of a child who had arrived with opinions already formed. Maren held her and felt something she didn't yet have language for. Not just love, something older. A recognition, deep and wordless. Like meeting someone you somehow already knew. Ronan was present for it the way she'd hoped, but hadn't known for certain. His hand steady on her back throughout, his voice low and unhurried. When Ren was placed in his arms for the first time, he went completely still, looking at her the way you look at something that has permanently rearranged everything you thought you understood about what mattered. He cried, didn't hide it, didn't apologize for it, just let it happen, the way a person does when they've stopped calculating and arrived somewhere real. That version of him, standing in that room, holding that child, with tears he didn't bother to wipe away, was the one Maren would return to again and again in the months that followed, when things grew complicated, when she needed to remind herself what was true about him. She would return to it far more than she ever expected to. Veil Plus Partners nearly folded when Ren was 7 months old. It happened the way financial crises happen inside small businesses, not all at once, but by accumulation. A major client walked away from a contract over a timeline dispute. 2 junior architects accepted offers from a larger firm that could guarantee the stability Ronan couldn't match. A bid they'd spent 3 months building lost to a competitor who had underpriced them by 30%. Each loss, alone, was survivable. Together, they weren't. One evening in November, Ronan sat down across from her at the kitchen table and laid out what the numbers actually looked like. Outstanding payroll, the office lease, equipment loans that had stopped being theoretical. He placed the documents between them the way you put something down when you've been carrying it alone for too long and your body has finally decided it's done. He didn't ask her for anything. That was the detail she would return to. Later, he didn't ask. He simply showed her, the way you only show someone the full picture when you trust them completely, or when you've exhausted every other option and trust is the only thing you have left to offer. She asked how much he needed to stabilize things. He gave her a number. 3 days later, she transferred $240,000 from the account where her mother's life had been sitting quietly, waiting for its purpose. She kept $20,000, enough for an emergency, enough to tell herself she hadn't handed over everything. It was 11 at night when she sat at the laptop, Ren asleep down the hall, Ronan at the table across from her, both hands around a mug of tea, watching without speaking. She typed in the amount, hit confirm, watched the balance change. She felt something move through her that she named, in that moment, as love, as certainty. as the clearest decision she had ever made. She told herself this was what her mother's money was for. A real beginning, a life where Ronan's firm survived, where Ren grew up with a father who hadn't been hollowed out by failure, where they built something together that would outlast the hard season they were in. She didn't ask for anything in return. She didn't want it to feel like a transaction. Love, she told herself, wasn't a ledger. She closed the laptop, went to bed, and believed it. The firm came back. Not overnight. Nothing real comes back overnight. It came back the way a tide returns, gradually, without announcement, until one day you look up and the waterline is higher than you remembered it being in months. Within a year of the transfer, Vale Plus Partners had cleared its outstanding debts. Within 18 months, Ronan had hired 2 new architects and moved the office to a larger space downtown, a converted floor with exposed brick and high windows that caught the morning light in a way he described, with the quiet pride of a man who believed in the language of rooms, as exactly right. He was energized the way success energizes people who had spent a season doubting themselves. He moved faster, spoke with more authority in client meetings, came home some evenings with a particular brightness in his eyes that Maren recognized as the look of a man doing exactly what he was built to do. She was glad for it. She sat across from him at dinner and watched him talk about new projects, with his hands moving the way they did when his mind was fully engaged. And she felt something she would have called happiness if she'd been asked to name it. She would have called it happiness. But something underneath all of it had begun to run at a slightly different temperature. Not cold, not wrong, just different. The way a room can feel subtly altered after furniture has been rearranged, and you can't immediately identify what changed. Only that something has. She told herself she was imagining it, and for a while, that was enough. It was in the spring of the firm's second recovered year that Ronan brought on an operations director. Her name was Celeste Vaughn. She had spent the previous decade working in corporate design, translating the vision of architects into the language their clients actually spoke. She was precise in the way that truly useful people are precise, not flashy, not performing competence, just consistently and quietly ahead of whatever the room needed next. Within 2 months of joining, she had restructured the firm's client proposal process. Within 4, she had renegotiated 2 vendor contracts in ways that saved money Ronan hadn't realized he was losing. Within 8 months, she had brought in 2 of the largest accounts in Vale Plus Partners history, contracts that required a level of corporate fluency Ronan had always struggled to project on his own. He was grateful for her, visibly, openly grateful. He started mentioning her the way people mention someone who has become load-bearing, not casually but with a particular weight of acknowledgement. He said she had changed how the firm operated. He said she had a read on clients that he'd spent years trying to develop on his own, and she'd simply walked in with it already fully formed. He said she was essential. Maren was in the kitchen when he used the word, standing at the counter, half listening to him debrief his day, and the word settled the way certain words settle, not loudly, but with a density that made it feel heavier than everything around it. She noticed the word, filed it. She didn't say anything. She turned back to what she was doing. The conversation moved on, and on the surface nothing had happened. Nothing had happened. She noticed other things too, small things, the kind of things you'd feel embarrassed to say out loud, because each one, standing alone, amounted to nothing. His phone screen tilted away from her when she passed behind him on the couch. Not a dramatic movement, just a slight, almost imperceptible angle adjustment, the kind the body makes without consulting the mind. She noticed it once and said nothing, a second time and said nothing again. By the third time, she had already decided not to count. His voice changed register on certain calls, not conspicuously. He didn't lower it to a whisper or step out of the room, but there was a particular quality that entered his tone, a care in the diction that she recognized from the earliest days of their relationship, the voice of a man thinking about how he sounded. He had grown more deliberate about his appearance, not vain. Ronan had never been vain, but conscious, the way a person becomes conscious when they have started to care about being perceived by someone specific. There was also the texture of his days. He used to tell her everything, not in a tedious play-by-play way, but in the way of someone for whom she was the first audience. The small frustrations, the unexpected wins, the strange thing a client said that he'd been turning over since lunch. She had been the person he processed the world with. She couldn't point to the moment that had stopped. She only knew it had. and that what he offered her now was the beginning and the end of his days, never the middle, the professional headline, never the story underneath it. She told herself she understood, that this was what it looked like from the inside when someone was finally operating at the level they'd always believed they were capable of, that a man becoming fuller in one direction naturally had less left over for everything else. She told herself this the way you repeat something until the repetition itself starts to feel like proof. She left it there, didn't push past it, didn't let herself follow the thought to wherever it was pointing, because the place it was pointing required a kind of courage she wasn't ready for yet. Ren was 2.5 by then, all opinions and momentum, forming sentences with arguments already built into them, trailing Maren through the kitchen with the focused energy of a small person who had decided that silence was a waste of time. Maren loved this stage with a ferocity that surprised her, the absolute, uncomplicated nature of it, the way Ren reached for her hand in the dark while falling asleep, as if Maren were the only fixed point in a world still figuring itself out. There was no ambiguity in it, no reading between lines. Ren needed her, fully and without apology, and Maren met that need with everything she had. She had scaled back her grant writing to part-time when Ren arrived, and hadn't scaled back up. There was always a reason, a scheduling conflict, a season that felt too demanding, a quiet sense that the household needed her presence more than her career, needed her momentum. She kept telling herself she'd return to full capacity when things settled. Things didn't settle. They just became the new shape of normal. She made herself smaller to make more room, not because anyone asked her to, not because Ronan had ever said a word about it, but because she had learned, long before Ronan, long before any of this, that the safest way to be loved was to need as little as possible, and to make yourself so useful that your absence would be felt before your presence was ever truly seen. The gala was announced in March. Veil Plus Partners, a celebration of 5 years and the future, a formal event at the Meridian Room, a converted warehouse venue downtown that had become the city's preferred space for high-end corporate gatherings. Ronan mentioned it in passing, the way he mentioned most things that excited him in those days, briefly, while already moving towards something else. Maren started preparing, quietly. She found a dress, deep green, fitted, the kind of dress you buy when you need to feel entirely like yourself. She made a hair appointment. She began composing, in her head, the small, wry stories she would tell if journalists or clients asked how she and Ronan had met. The kind of warm, self-possessed story that made people like you instantly and remember you long after. She had always been good at that, at making people feel that meeting her was worth their time. She hadn't told Ronan about the dress. She wanted it to be a small surprise. She kept returning, privately, to the image of the look on his face when he saw her walk in. That particular look from the early years, the one that said he was taking stock of something he knew he was fortunate to have. She was still holding that image when he told her, 2 weeks before the gala, that it was a business function this year. He said it in the kitchen, on a Tuesday evening, transferring leftovers into containers with his eyes on what his hands were doing. He said it the way you say something you've already rehearsed, carefully, evenly, with the smoothness of a delivery that has been practiced until it no longer sounds like one. The firm is really trying to position itself professionally this year. It's mostly client-facing, not really a +1 situation. Maren set down her glass. She said, "Okay." He said he hoped she understood. She said she did. Drop a comment right now. Tell me, did you catch it? Because Maren said okay. She said she understood. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't ask a single question. But she understood far more than he intended her to. What do you think she understood? Tell me in the comments. Because I want to know if you caught what she caught. The office visit wasn't planned as anything significant. Ronan had been asking for a tax document for 3 weeks, a folder that had been sitting in the second drawer of their home filing cabinet, beneath a utilities statement and a warranty card for an appliance they no longer owned. Maren had finally located it on a Thursday afternoon and decided to drop it off on her way to pick up Ren from playgroup across town. Veil Plus Partners occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Tryon Street now, the new space with the high windows Ronan loved, the one he'd described with quiet pride as exactly right. She hadn't been inside more than twice since they'd relocated. Porto was at the front desk when she arrived. He had been with Ronan since the early days. A mild, distracted man with reading glasses perpetually perched at the wrong angle, the kind of person who made an office feel inhabited rather than simply occupied. He was shuffling through a stack of papers with the focused agitation of someone who had misplaced the one specific thing they needed. He handed her a printed sheet to hold while he searched. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just holding it. She glanced at it the way you glance at anything placed in your hands, out of reflex, not intention. It was the Gala guest list. Her eyes moved down the page the way they move when you're not truly reading, taking in the shapes of names without fully landing on any of them. Until they did. Celeste Vane, +1, not a client, not a press contact, not a name followed by a company affiliation or a professional title. Just a name, and beside it, 2 words that quietly reframed every conversation she'd had with Ronan in the past 6 months. She stood there for a moment that had no particular length to it. Then she folded the paper, slowly, with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who understood that how she handled the next 30 seconds would become the shape of something she'd carry for a long time. She set it back on Porto's desk, placed the tax document she'd come to deliver on the front counter, said goodbye to Porto, who was still searching for whatever he'd misplaced and barely looked up. She walked to the elevator, wrote it down, crossed the lobby, got into her car. She drove home without the radio on, not because she was falling apart, but because she needed the silence the way you need a clean surface when you're about to set something down that requires space. Share this video with someone who pays attention to the little things. Because everything Maren had noticed over the past year, every small, deniable detail she had filed away and talked herself out of, had just snapped into place. The word, essential, the tilted phone screen, the voice that changed, register on certain calls, the kitchen conversation delivered without looking up, all of it, at once. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones you already knew, just before you let yourself know them. She didn't tell Ronan what she'd seen, not that night, not the night after. She sat with it the way she sat with most difficult things, quietly, turning it over, examining it from every angle before she decided what it was. She was not a woman who acted from the first feeling. She was a woman who lived inside a feeling for a long time before she let it out. What she kept returning to wasn't the name on the list. It was the Tuesday evening in the kitchen, the careful, not looking up, the practiced evenness of the delivery. He hadn't stumbled, hadn't paused in a way that suggested he was choosing his words. A man with nothing to conceal doesn't rehearse the explanation. She thought about the night she transferred the money. 11 at night, laptop open on the kitchen table, Ren asleep down the hall. The way she had typed in the amount and hit confirm and felt something she'd named, in that moment, as love, as certainty, as the clearest decision she had ever made. On the second day, she looked something up. She wasn't sure why she needed the number, only that she did. The Meridian room rented for approximately $6,000 an evening. She did the math, the way you do math, when you already know what the answer will make you feel. $240,000 divided by 6,000. 40 evenings. She had paid for 40 evenings in that room. She had paid for the accounts Celeste Vane had come to manage, for the desk where Celeste worked, for the recovery that had given Ronan the footing to become someone who no longer needed to show her the middle of his days. She had paid for the room where her name wasn't on the list. She wasn't owed a thank you. She knew that love wasn't a ledger. The third time that thought arrived, it didn't feel like wisdom. It felt like a door closing. The night of the gala, Maren ran Ren a bath. She listened from the doorway while Ren conducted what could only be described as a formal proceeding between a rubber duck and a plastic boat. Voices assigned, grievances outlined. A verdict delivered with the gravity of someone who had given the matter considerable prior thought. Maren listened, asked clarifying questions through the open door, affirmed the ruling with appropriate solemnity. She lifted Ren out of the water and wrapped her in the large towel they kept on the hook, the one with the hood that made Ren look, briefly, like a very serious monk. She held her daughter against her chest in the lingering warmth of the steam, feeling the particular weight of a small body that trusts you completely. Soap and warmth and damp hair that had its own opinions about direction. She began to hum. It was her mother's song, one of the old ones Dolores used to sing while cooking, low and unhurried, something southern and half-remembered that had passed through the family the way certain things pass, not through intention, but through repetition, year after year, until it became part of the air of a home. The melody was more intact than the words. Maren had never been entirely sure of the lyrics, only that the tune had a particular shape that meant someone is here. That meant you don't have to be afraid of the quiet. Wren went still against her, the way children go still when a sound reaches them at exactly the right frequency. This was real. Whatever else was true about the evening, whatever was unfolding across town at the Meridian Room right now, this was real. This weight in her arms, this warmth, this small person breathing slowly against her chest, entirely certain of where she belonged. This, Maren knew with certainty. She put Wren to bed with 2 picture books and the song again, softer this time, stretched thin over the space between waking and sleep. She sat at the edge of her daughter's bed in the near dark until the breathing deepened and the small hands finally released their grip on the blanket's edge. Then she went to the kitchen, made tea, sat down at the table, the same 2 chairs. She opened the second drawer, the folder she kept there, the one with the documents you needed every few years, and then urgently, all at once. She had come to this drawer with purpose twice now. The first time, she had reached in and pulled out her mother's entire life savings and transferred them to a man who needed a floor beneath him. She had done it at 11 at night with Wren asleep down the hall, and she had felt, in the moment she hit confirm, that she was doing the most loving thing she had ever done. Tonight was the second time. She placed 2 things on the table: the bank transfer receipt, 3 years old, the paper slightly soft at the fold lines from being handled more than once, and Wren's birth certificate, cream-colored and official, printed in the careful font of something that intended to last. She set them side by side, didn't rush it. Under the heading Father, in clean black type, Ronan James Vale. She looked at his name for a long time. She thought about everything that name represented. The man in the delivery room with tears he didn't bother to hide. The man who had laid out the numbers on this very table with his hands wrapped around each other, showing her the truth of where things stood. The man she had watched grow into something larger than the version of himself she had first met, standing by a bookshelf in Charlotte. She had given him that growth. Not alone. He had built it, genuinely, but she had given him the ground to build on. Her mother's decades of careful living, distilled into a number, transferred in the quiet of an 11 o'clock night, while Ronan sat across from her and said nothing and held his mug of tea. She had given him a daughter with his eyes and her patience. She had given him the floor beneath everything he was currently standing on, and he had written the guest list without her name on it. If this story has you locked in right now, if you feel what Maren is feeling sitting at that table, hit the like button, because what comes next is the part that will stay with you. She didn't cry, not that night. What she felt sitting at that table wasn't the sharp, clarifying pain of a wound just received. It was something slower, something closer to the feeling of waking up in a room you thought you knew and discovering, in the actual light, that the walls are a different color than you remembered. Not a shock, not even a surprise exactly. A reckoning. She thought about the way she had organized her love, the transfer, the logistics, the appointments kept, and the appointments made, the way she had absorbed difficulty so that Ronan didn't have to meet it at the door when he came home, the way she had made herself useful, consistently, quietly, without attaching a condition to any of it, because she had believed, somewhere beneath her awareness, that this was what love looked like when it matured past the early electricity, the quiet work of choosing someone every day. What she hadn't understood, what she was sitting in the kitchen beginning to understand, was that choosing had only ever moved in one direction. She had been choosing him, fully, with every resource available to her, her money, her time, her career set aside by degrees she had barely noticed accumulating, her mother's gift, redirected without ceremony. She had chosen him in every language she knew how to speak, and he had received that choosing as something closer to weather than to sacrifice, something that existed reliably in the background of his life, present the way a foundation is present, entirely necessary, never considered. A person can love you and still not see you. She understood that now, and the invisibility was worse. She was beginning to understand this too, when it came from someone you had made visible, when the platform was yours and the view was his, and he had never once turned around to acknowledge what he was standing on. She had spent 3 years being the most important person in a story that Ronan had been quietly rewriting, small revision by small revision, until she was no longer a character in it at all, just the setting. He came home at 1:15 in the morning. Maren heard the key in the lock from where she lay in the dark. She listened to the sounds of him moving through the house, The kitchen, the familiar quiet of the hallway, a pause outside Ren's door that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. She had mapped his movements so many times over the years that she could follow them without looking. She knew exactly where he was by the quality of the silence between sounds. He came into the bedroom without turning on the light. She heard him set his things down, heard the careful, considered quiet of a man trying not to wake anyone, the particular thoughtfulness of someone who had spent a good evening and was still inside the warmth of it. He got into bed. A few minutes passed. Then, softly, "How was your night?" she said. "Fine. Ren go down okay?" "Yes." He exhaled. Long, slow, settling, the release of a man who had moved through the world successfully and was now allowing himself to feel it. The exhale of someone who had arrived exactly where he intended to be. She lay in the dark beside him and said nothing more. She listened to his breathing slow toward sleep, and she thought about her mother, about a woman who had spent her life making things smooth for everyone around her, who had left behind $260,000 as the only real evidence of everything she had quietly gone without, about what it meant to give everything you had and call it love, and about what it cost when the person you gave it to never felt the weight. She thought about the note, 7 words in her mother's handwriting, folded between 2 pages of an estate document, passed to her in the weeks after Dolores went quietly on a Tuesday morning in October. She had read it twice and set it down and put the money away for 8 months, waiting to feel like she deserved it. For when you need a real beginning, Dolores had meant it as a gift. Maren had spent it as an apology for needing to be loved, for being the kind of woman who needed a man to stay, to choose her back, to turn toward her in the middle of his days and say, "I see you. I see everything you're holding, not just the parts that are useful to me." She understood now, lying in the dark, listening to Ronan breathe, that a gift and an apology were not the same thing, that her mother had not saved carefully for 30 years, had not driven a car until it quit, had not gone without comfort or rest or a single unnecessary thing, so that her daughter could hand it all to someone who received it as simply his due. And she understood something else. A woman who could give $240,000 without conditions, without a contract, without a single request in return, was a woman capable of profound, extraordinary love. She had simply been directing it at the wrong person. Down the hall, Ren was sleeping, dark eyes closed, small hands open, a child who had arrived ahead of schedule and demanded, without apology, that the people who loved her rise to meet her completely. Maren knew, lying there in the dark, that whatever she taught her daughter about what she deserved, she would teach it first by example, not by what she said, by what she chose to do next. She didn't make a decision that night, not a clean, declarative one. What she made was a beginning, the quiet, interior kind, the kind that happens before anyone else can see it, before there is anything to point to, the kind her mother would have recognized immediately, the kind Dolores had been trying to hand her, in 7 words, all along. So here is the question this story leaves behind, not for Maren. For you, what have you spent in the currency of your silence? What have you given, your time, your money, your momentum, your mother's handwritten hope, and called it love, when part of it was fear? Fear that if you named your own worth out loud, the people who needed you not to would finally leave. And when does the person carrying all of that finally need to hear themselves say, "That was a gift, not a guarantee"? If Maren's story puts something into words that you've been carrying quietly, something you couldn't quite name even to yourself, subscribe to Wounds Among Kin, because that's what this channel is here for, not to tell you what to feel, but to give the feeling a shape. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it. Someone in your life is sitting at a kitchen table tonight, looking at 2 pieces of paper, beginning to understand something they have known for a long time. They need to hear this too.